truly passionate about, and having you guys join this morning to chat about LMS implementation and selection is really something that I appreciate. So I wanted to start off this morning really with an overview of where we are and where we're going. First, Steve introduced a little bit of background. My real first introduction on the LMS side of the world was back in the mid-90s when I started with Marathon Oil, and part of my initial responsibilities there was putting a system in place. And a lot of that was around meeting regulatory compliance inside refined petrochemical facilities. So high criticality training kind of environment, a lot of different and unique demands, especially as you work across different state lines and international lines there. And about 13 years ago now, I moved over full-time to the RISC side, so I've been working on implementations really outside of the petrochemical space, and so other vertical markets, looking both and domestically. So hopefully I can bring some of those things to bear today as we go through and take a look at what LMS and why do I need one. Starting off with those easy questions. The market has changed a bit over the last few years. That concern with, gosh, is this something that there's a valid business need for my organization? How do we sort those things out? And we'll take a look at those things, and also some of the I think of as the confusing items inside the industry. Clearly, we're bad about tossing around acronyms, SCORM, ICC, and LMS, and LRS, and TS for talent management systems. So we'll chat a little bit about what is an LMS, what is not an LMS there. Moving there, how do you go about making the decision on what's the right fit system to manage your needs? There is a problem for such a young industry. I think most on the market now are really in their 10 to 15 years. A lot of newer systems. There are a few of us that are now in our 20s and a bit older systems. But it's surprising to me how many systems get implemented inside an organization and very rapidly will fail to gain traction and end up moving into a second. And I see some companies now going into third generation systems. And hopefully what we can do is head some of those things off by having effective selection process going up front, because even though there's a wide variety of systems on the market, once you really define your requirements, it helps pare those things back and really set you up much more for success there. And when something like Burson and Associates, Josh Burson's published that it's normally 2 to 3 times the cost of the LMS itself to make the implementation process. Clearly, getting it right the first time is an important piece of that whole puzzle. So we'll do that, and then we'll do the implementation, some of the pitfalls with what I do now that I have decided on a system. Who are the right players? Who do I need to be partners with for getting that system up and running? And this future trends is a little bit of a crystal ball session there, and it's a place where I certainly love your feedback and I don't want to take questions all the way through, but I'm glad what I see in the industry and some of those trends that have been changing. And I just got back from the Mobile Learning Conference out in San Diego last week, so some of the things that are happening there and have a lot of activity. So we'll start going down that road as well. I think first I'm going to do this as just absolutely informal, if we want to use that window again. I guess, how many folks have, or you can raise your hand inside the system itself. So how many groups here have an LMS already inside the organization? If you want to combine, see, lots of hands going up quickly there, so I appreciate that. I'm going to expand my window here so I can actually see all of those hands coming. For those of you that do, how many have more than one system in place inside your organization? I find this is a pretty common, pretty common thing to have happen. Different sites may have started off in different directions, or you might have even internally a system that's very compliance-based versus a system that's more HR-driven, and the side there is you end up with difficulty in really making consolidated reports across the system. I have my data in multiple places, so some of the challenges that can happen there. And then finally, how many of guys are making some kind of change, either make LMS migration, or maybe augmenting what you're doing now with a new system. So, all right, certainly some questions coming through, and I appreciate your participation there. So, first, just establishing a bit of a common language between us. What is an LMS? And this is a Brandon Hall quote, where it's a software for automating the administration of training events, registration of users, course catalogs, record data, provide some reports. The ASTD in their learning circuits, which is ATD now, to say a really robust system should help centralize and automate administration. This is one of those that's always a goal of mine as I walk into a group or working with a new group, saying, gosh, what can we do to make the of training easier? Can we automate reports? Can you automate the assignment of training requirements? Can you push more out into self-service mode so that employees and their supervisors maybe are managing schedules? So these are some of the things that we're really looking at in the LMS world, but essentially software to help act as the infrastructure to training. And I don't want to neglect that reporting part. One of the things, and especially Stephen, the XAPI, the Tin Can standard, which kind of further increases the amount of data that can be collected inside learning management systems, other applications that take that data. And what do we do with all of this information about training? Because I really want to make sure that things are set up to help meet the business needs. So we'll take a look there. A couple that I'm not going to talk about are things that are a little bit outside scope, but often get confused here. I'm not going to talk much about learning content management systems. An LMS is really more of a collaborative tool generally for content developers for creating, storing, versioning the online content that they make. Not something at all do I want to discount, because having good source control around learning content, I think, has largely been neglected, where software industry is a great example, where you always work inside some kind of source control system. That LCMS is really more of that source control repository for learning content. Having some similar or some overlapping features there tend to work in tandem. And then you know, I hear a lot on talent management systems, and over the past couple of years, it seems like every LMS on the market changed signs for being the talent management system on the market. On the talent side, it's more an expansion to also include things like recruiting and performance management, which often does tie into learning and development with things like competency management systems. But the thing that's a little bit unique on the fully robust talent side is that focus on compensation as well. So something that would be outside of our scope for today. The other thing, and I guess should have mentioned putting or should have put this acronym on as well here. Things that you'll hear people say, especially in conferences, recently, or as mentioning an LRS, or a learning records store. Learning records store, relatively new term on the market. It's something that is driven by that tin can, that XAPI stand, where in a traditional SCORM world or a traditional AICC world, I was really always starting from a browser in the line content and having that right back to the LMS, where now Learning Records Store as part of the API standard allows me to write directly to that RS, and then that can be imported on into the LMS, but it helps take the browser requirement out of that whole equation. We get into far too much detail on XAPI, and actually be glad to provide more information. And we just did a webinar, one of our colleagues here this last month, a presentation at SimLearn last week on the system there. So if you want additional information on that side, glad to provide that. Again, just not something we'll drill into in a huge amount of detail, but wanted to make sure that that we're aware. So again, tying those together. So who does need an LMS? Are you providing training? And if so, what kind of training is that? And then that always seems like a simple forward question, but some things and some groups that provide a little formal training, others with a much more robust system, but that the LMS or having an LMS in place really can help assist with. Again, I mentioned it, acting as the infrastructure for your training are things like delivery that push of required online content, managing online registration across maybe multiple locations with things like waitlist management and prerequisite checking. So again, think about what are those training offerings that I'm providing. Maybe I'm a content provider, I'm not training employees at all, but I need to deliver training out to my clients, my business partners. Maybe that's a revenue source, and I need to have something integrated with an e-commerce element for managing that training. So again, can help drive me to LMS. These are also things that we'll think about in a second when we talk about what system I'd want to select, because they start defining your needs. Another big driver, is my training subject to, do I have some kind of regulatory requirement? Do I need to be able to provide documentation for seat employment grants and things like that require me to have good tracking of the actual training that happened for those students? There's some easy examples grouping under OSHA requirements, EPA requirements, DOT requirements, working internationally under ISO standards, all things that can really be supported if you have one considered place for tracking training records. Courses repeated. A lot of times these are things that might fall more on that technical training side. If I have to maintain my CPR certification, and I know that that's something that's issued for 2 years, I'd like my LMS to be able to manage that, and at the beginning of the quarter, tell me how many people are going to need CPR refresher training, or forklift operator training, or whatever the case is there. So again, another thing that can help unload the administrative burden associated with training by putting a system in place. Who's the training load? Okay, what in the world does that mean, Duncan? I love how central decentralized it really does change the implementation. A lot of times it will change the system that is the best fit. And at two different examples, we work with a lot of retail clients, and in that there's a grocery retail environment, very centralized training organization, right? I might have a small training group, maybe just 5 or 6 people at a corporate office, but a huge employee load. So with geographically dispersed students, so I need a system where I can put training down, maybe have reporting at the store manager level or a district manager level, but not really managing that training individually at that location. It's more receiving it, taking things that are prescriptive. Where if you look at another example, I'll go back to my main example, or that petrochemical kind of example, where I certainly have global training requirements or things that span multiple sites. Everyone's taking code of business conduct across the organization, and hopefully that's the same code of business conduct, the same content. Now, mine might be in English and someone else's is in Chinese, but realistically, want to be able to track and manage those things. But I also might have individual facilities that all have their own training departments, so they're focused exclusively on that training, or primarily on training that's unique to the individual location, and it kind of works in tandem with that centralized group. So depending on your centralization, decentralization, this is something that can help justify or drive that LMS move. At perfect base level there, is your current method of tracking adequate? I know of groups that don't have a lot of repetitious training, that don't have very prescriptive training plans, not a lot of things that are subject to audit, and especially smaller groups, they work well for years tracking training in other methods, whether that's the file cabinet method, or that's using some kind of Excel spreadsheet or internally developed database. We think that an LMS is something that a company or a training group often matures into as their training continue to expand. So again, do you have the particular need here? That's really the driver. We're not talking about systems that are generally inexpensive to put in place. Now, some of that has changed greatly. Thinking about put systems in place through the mid to late 90s, before there was really the advent of this cloud-hosted environment. These are actually capital expenditures required, IT infrastructure, and those things. So even though all of that has minimized a bit with working in what's been called a SaaS model, or a cloud model, or a application service provider model, is to justify that business need. And I want to make sure that we always do that. So again, who needs an LMS? I neglected that one bullet there on the format media of training, but had mentioned earlier things like driving out on training tend to be much easier to manage if you have some kind of system in place. So a lot of groups do a system or could benefit from a system. And again, that the number of on-demand hosted systems really has made it easier to get into the system, especially for a small and medium-sized business where you can start up very quickly and relatively inexpensively. But that leads to the question, what system do I need? And again, some of this, gosh, what training are you doing now, and where do you want to go in the future? Because some systems focus very heavily on online training, and if you're going to manage a lot of, let's say, training events, whether those are instructor-led sessions live in person or if those virtual classroom sessions, I want to make sure that I have the scheduling functions that are needed there. A lot of fine groups going the other direction where they're really making a big push to move from instant training and augment that more with, or supplement that more with online. And one of the things that they're looking for is that infrastructure. So one of the key pieces there, especially from trying to avoid problems down the road, is solicit the needs from other users inside the organization. This is a hard one. This is a hard one for me coming in as an outsider when working with companies, because a lot of times turning over rocks, and you'll have everyone together and talking about what your training data and what things are you delivering. You think to have all of those stakeholders together, and then someone says, oh gosh, no, but there's this other training program that's managed by this group, or have thought about the fact that we needed to bring this other population in. So if you can get that feedback across the organization, I think that always helps, clearly in the buy-in that you'd expect, but also in defining what those needs are. The places where I've seen, let's say, embarrassing and difficult failures is when a group in isolation really pushes out a system that doesn't meet the needs, especially of those, so to say, the end user, the field kind of students or employees that are out there. You know, this is something that was bundled with maybe another, as part of an HR system, or was made available through maybe a professional employer association, a PEO. So it's something that we try to make it work, but if you have the opportunity to get that feedback, get those needs in advance, always is helpful. There, you know, a lot of organizations, I think, just fail in pulling those things together. You still do have to remain a partner with IT. And this, again, clearly a much bigger deal if you're running the system inside, behind your firewall, but even if not, it's that IT group that's going to help with things like a single sign-on. Do you want to allow people to go directly over into the system as part of your network? Well, I'm going to need IT support there. And if you wait to get that after the fact, or you solicit it after the fact, it'd be a much more difficult battle in my experience, where if you come in and there's some partnership up front, those IT folks often can head off the problems. They know are at things like infrastructure and bandwidth that already exist inside the organization, and may be able to provide some guidance there. So something that to always look at. And the final one's consult legal. I can't believe we have anybody that's left on the call after this slide, because very few people want to contact IT, and even fewer want to consult with their legal group. But realistically, it's something that is important. One, there's going to be contracts and agreements in place there that are going to have to be reviewed. We also have concerns with things like data privacy. The way that we handle records in the United States is very different than managing records inside the European Union, and then maybe more specifically, say within Germany with Works Council requirements around employee or person data privacy. So good to get that kind of feedback in early. So things, just thinking about the big ticket items. Gosh, is this a single language system? Is this a multi-language system? How am I going to manage currencies? If I'm delivering training in different geographic locations with different currencies, am I going to roll all of my cost reporting onto a single universal currency, say US dollars or sterling or whatever the case is there? So these are things that help me define what functions I need inside the system. And with that, what I can do is start building a decision matrix and separating what's good to have versus the things I really need to have, because I have to meet those need items. But I often find that it's the nice to have or those good to have items that drive purchasing going through. One of the kind of things I find that's difficult is you get that one trade show trip where you collect, these are all the new features and functions, and I say, I need one of all of these, and say, how am I going to actually use it? So separating out, what is valid and what's not valid. Realistic there. There's the determining of a budget, clearly. I mentioned that these systems vary radically in cost, radically in features and functions too, though they tend to have a fairly common core. But something certainly to think about, that can certainly drive whether you're going into multi-systems or individual systems. When I say multi-tenant, there are a lot of systems on the market that store multiple companies, multiple organizations, training data in one database, multi-tenant, like an apartment building. And there are some that are individual, separate standalone systems for each group, even in a hosted environment. And some groups with much higher security demands, security requirements, will opt for those standalone systems, even to the point of being able to manage things like separated tape backups, because if for some reason my training records as an organization get subpoenaed, I don't want those records intermixed with other company records there. So again, just to think about, and then identifying those IT constraints. Do you have users that are going to be working on thin bandwidth connections, right? Maybe satellite connections from an offshore facility or someone in a remote area there. Do you have a wide population, say, of Apple users and Android users in addition to your traditional browser users? So again, a lot of those things drive your buying decision. Also, like I mentioned earlier, the single sign-on integration with systems. So even though I'm constraints here, most of the time, certainly in a corporate environment, I'm going to integrate with some kind of input source, student data source. So if I need to pull data from SAP so that when I transfer from one job title to another, the LMS update my training requirements, they're good things to have kind of upfront as part of your decision matrix. And some major considerations: are you looking internal or hosted? Sometimes decision changes as you go through that evaluation process. But at a level, am I going to put this on our own servers, or are we going to access it completely off off the internet. Again, mention training methods. How am I going to do training? Is it something that's organized just my side, or is this really something that's more enterprise-wide? Because those enterprise-wide installations, maybe multiple locations, I want to think about security controls. What can administrators do at one site versus another site? How are we going to share data? How do we want to lay things out to manage reporting? Because I'm going to be able to report based on the data that I have loaded in that system. There's an authoring tool integration. So if you're already using, say, training library from Skillsoft or do safe training, or you're working with an authoring tool like Storyline or Captivate or Articulate, then how does that system work with those tools? And again, I am always a fan of seeing that integration work inside the actual application. So hey, send me of your training module and let me put it into a demo system and see how that thing looks, feels, runs, because it's easy to about that end user experience, student learner experience there. So what kind of integration do you need? Standard compliance. We talked about standards just a little bit. Things like AICC and SCORM. So if you know you're going to be developing course content, or you think you'll be developing course content there, and you want to be able to pull that information in, then you want to make sure that your system is compliant with whatever standard your authoring tool is using. Platform support. I mentioned that Apple versus Android versus your traditional browser there, and how people are working. So again, something to certainly consider. And then other big considerations. We term customization just a ton in the industry, I think, in general. But so from a budget standpoint, from someone who's putting an implementation in place, customization do you want versus configuration? And I always try to leave customization as an absolute final option there. I want a system that's completely configurable, right? So that it is, so that I can configure it to have the look, feel, and function that I need in my organization, but I can still stay on a current version and get upgrades and those kind of things. And if I need to change that configuration as my needs grow, develop, change, then I'll do that. Where customization, and I'm seeing less today than I did just a few years ago, but there was a point when everything needed to be customized around a very specific need, organization to organization. And what has happened in a lot of times, if someone off the upgrade path, they wouldn't get new features and functions. And you then get kind of married to an ongoing cost associated with adding things that require additional customization versus configuration that you can just turn on and off. I mentioned it with external systems, reporting analytics. Going into the process of making vendor selections. If you have specific reports or specific analytic data that you need to get out of the system, maybe that group can provide the reporting that you need there. And I'll have I was working in West Africa here a while back, and even this is the report that we have to turn into the to the central government quarter for training reporting. And hey, let's recreate this thing inside the LMS itself. The data's all there, but how do you get that information back out so that it's in the right format there? So again, things to think about. Implementation, what's a normal standard time from vendor? A lot of times this can be a difficult question to answer because it's like, Anything else. If it's a giant enterprise installation, then it's going to certainly take longer than a single site. I've had those times where installations you can essentially go in 2 days, manually set up all the employees and all the courses that they have that they need to do tracking for any of those requirement plans. But that's certainly not the norm there. So what does that look like? And then when it comes right down to it, support and the vendors use community. It's something that you're going to put in place. And so almost all your employees are going to touch at some point in time. And so what customer support look like? How long has the group been in business? Is there active user community? Are you getting new updates regularly from that system? And if not, gosh, maybe I should consider options. So start with what you do, right? That's the problem that you need to solve, and do your homework with them to find out what are good potential solutions there. And then when you're actually getting to the decision-making point, is this something that's being done by committee or individual? You solicit that feedback from groups like IT and make sure that everyone's needs are there. But everybody knows that making a decision by committee is a slower process and can be difficult there. So you have to decide, who are the decision makers inside the organization. Are you going to issue an RFP or not issue an RFP? It's a request for a proposal. So as I get more in both directions there, there's a lot of philosophy that everyone needs to have an RFP for any kind of mirror system in place. That way all the vendors provide answer common questions, and you can evaluate. But a lot of times, if you're going to go that route, what I would recommend always is something like a narrative RFP. Really can put in some solid scenario kind of questions and get that vendor to respond to how they would meet that specific need versus those very generic, yes, the system can do this, or no, they can't. And a lot of off-shelf RFPs you can find and repurpose, but they tend to be at that very general level, and I don't know that they provide much value when you're actually doing the decision-making process. But they'll get you cut down to a reasonable number of vendors because you've already defined those needs, you've looked at what their capabilities are, and now you get to that point that you really do want to see the system. I would find there is you can't demo every system, so you do really want to have a short list, but also, just like keeping that RFP narrative, keep those demos very narrative too. I'd really always prefer to have a demo that's being driven by that end user, that person that's evaluating systems. You might say, gosh, I want to see kind of from start to finish, set up a course, schedule a session, assign it, let us request it, have an email go to their supervisor, have the supervisor approve it, and then I want to see it show up with a calendar reminder for the student. That's beautiful. Those are the kind of things that I would love to do inside every demo. So think about building those scenarios so that you can see, like, from that end user experience, but also from the administrator experience. This is goes without saying, but you do make sure that your vendor has actual clients, and chat with those folks, especially if you have someone nearby. I think it's pretty common, and I never see much pushback from it. If there's someone that's working locally, now if they're direct competitors or something, it may be a bit different. But if I'm sitting in downtown Chicago and I'm evaluating systems, if as a vendor I know that I have another user that's in Chicago, I need to get these folks, and I've had groups before where they've come in and sat for a half hour or even half a day with a company that's evaluating systems just so they can see how they're really applying it inside the organization. So again, good option there. The final one, and this is one that I think gets neglected very, very often, is do you want to pilot, or do you have the luxury of piloting a system? And an internally loaded system, this is often not an insurmountable task, but something that can be very difficult, right? Because I have to do the installation and have the IT support. But in a hosted environment where I'm accessing the application completely through the internet, it's all cloud-based, piloting is suddenly much easier to do. So if I have a small subset of students, or I might have an initial program I need to roll out, a new business ethics module for supervisors, or an anti-bribery and corruption module for just my people that fit into some kind of or finance group. My thing is, most vendors now will allow some kind of short-term pilot inside a system. Maybe I just sign a 90-day contract and set up with some kind of small group there, and then learn and continue to expand. Implementation standpoint, again, implementation critical, because until we've put the system in place and really have data populated, it's it's no different than buying any other software. There's just not that much value in having it there until it's really fleshed out. So is that something you're going to outsource or do in-house? Most of the time there's at least some kind of blend there, even though I've seen some groups say, gosh, we want to run the system and then give us the keys and we'll take care of it for here. Others that say, I don't care what is in the background, I want to walk in and it basically turnkey. But do you sources to do that internally? Or what kind of partnership can you have with a vendor? And there are also third-party groups do implementation that are not necessarily tied to the vendor or not vendor employees. So something to consider there. But by all means, you have to treat it like a project. You have to set timelines for when data is going to be gathered, when data will be loaded, how reports are going to be set up, when does training happen, and allocate resources for those things. Someone's going to have to run this system. And in some groups, that's not a full-time job. In other groups, it might be teams of people, depending on how your training is managed. So something to think about going in. But during this entire process, document. Keep those meeting notes, identify those decisions, because a lot of this becomes your governance document moving forward, right? So it maps data between, say, an SAP system and the LMS, or PeopleSoft and the LMS. I want to document what were the decisions there, how we're going to manage, say, adding contractors to avoid co-employment issues and those things. So again, build that as you go through this process, knowing it's something that's going to change a little bit there. The very specific things was like to think about how do you stay sustainable with your data. So how are you keeping employees grading, who has access to add courses, how are those courses going to be managed? Are there going to be custodians that are identified? During the implementation, what history are we pulling maybe from another system or manually updating? If I have courses with pressure frequencies, I need to look at taking history as far back as my greatest refresher frequency so that everyone's training stays in line when they migrate into a new system. Again, if there's specific things in the data that drive your reporting, need to be documented from a governance standpoint, so that other groups, as new administrators come in and things expand, everyone's putting data in consistently and can get consistent reporting out. So again, that whole staying evergreen, what's the sustainability piece? The final real key for me on the implementation side of the world too is defining what your market strategy is, your rollout plan. It's easy to get caught in the trap of, hey, we've set everything up and now I'm going to release it to the public, and now that I've built it, they will come. But not always the case. You may be surprised to find out people don't always run and knock at the door and ask to do training. So as you go through and you start setting the system up, what are some of those things that can be done to drive usage early? You know, is it something from a contest standpoint? Is it something from communications out to employees and supervisors, setting that expectation, having some kind of driver there where I can get some value? And that's really the key. If your employees or your students can go into that system, can access content that they need at the time that they need it, it really does help drive that value up. If supervisors can take a look at the dashboard and see that their employees are 100% in compliance today, but by the end of the month, their folks are going to need to have their commercial driver's license renewed, then that helps them with that planning and increases that value. So again, really, I can't neglected it piece. So as you go through that implementation, think about how you're going to get that system out in front of those new students. So that, just a couple thoughts on future trends here, and I recognize the fact that I'm running to the very top of the hour, and I know that there's a question or two. But I was sadly, I'm sorry, I was reading this. Someone had mentioned they were going to bounce off, and I'll certainly make these slides available for everybody that joined. But future trends, some expansion at this point, and this is kind of the growth of technology inside different organizations. And you have systems that are continuing to add features and functions and can cause some separation between systems as you're comparing. But it also begins to blur a lot of the lines between a lot of, say, those things inside talent management systems. So a lot of times, talent management systems will handle competency assessments. A lot of the LMS will handle competency assessments. If I'm doing performance reviews in some other system and my supervisor says, hey, Duncan, you have a need here, how do I get back to the resources inside my LMS for getting those? So something that's there. There is still a lot of mergers or merging of LMS providers inside the space, as there was just a couple years ago. I'm seeing more and more LMS implementation in small companies and some of these, the 50 per mark kind of organization. So that has really changed, say, in the way we look at these hosted implementations, especially. A lot of super company integration. When I say that, I mean the big organizations like IP buying SuccessFactors last year and making an integrated application of systems, Oracle with PeopleSoft and doing some of that same thing. So those kind of large organizational integrations, and then something that's really still a hotbed in this area, I feel like, is the standards development improvement. And again, going back to the SEC, kind of evolving into some of the form work, AL that has been SCORM, then pushing the move to TINCAN or the XAPI, and now there are groups like the IEEE. They're looking at taking XAPI and some of the CMI5 standards and moving those continually forward too. So that's going to move and change inside the industry. Others there, I probably neglected to put in the big push on the mobile side of the world now too. So as a supervisor, access dashboards in a mobile environment. Can I approve my students for courses? Maybe I can do performance assessments and those things there. I'm interested in offline. So a lot of those are what I see around inside the market now. But I'd love to find out about others if anyone has thoughts there, things that they see or questions. Because with that, I recognize I am at the end of my range on you, and I apologize. But I am glad to stay over and take any questions here. I see there are some in the chat window there. But then also after the fact, by all means, can reach me at duncanw@risc-inc.com. My phone number 281-480-7910, and then our website risc-inc.com for some more general information there. With that, did you have any?
There's one question that was asked by Meg, and she wanted to know, before you send out an RFP, do you normally send out a request for information, RFI?
I'd love to kind of get the feedback from the rest of the group there. I'd say I very rarely, and I'm going to put on my vendor hat and speak of it from the company standpoint here, rarely see a formal RFI process followed by a formal RFP process. It certainly happens, right? And we get some live requests for information, then have to build in some additional detail after the fact. I see either people jumping straight to that RFP process or doing those terms interchangeably. And here's a request for information or request for proposal or request for quote, and it's more of a single round versus something that builds there. But I'd say if others have experiences there, I'd love to get feedback.
And that, Duncan, we don't have any other questions or comments. Let's see if Megan says thanks for the answer, that was helpful. Let me stop for a second, see if there's anybody else that's got any other questions. Most everyone, it looks like, probably had something they had to get to at the top of the hour. Since we don't have any more, thank you very much for participating today. Certainly appreciate it. Duncan, thank you for sharing your expertise. And for all of those that are here in the States, wish you have a happy holiday tomorrow. Thanks, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.